All right, welcome everyone to U.S. History 1302. Once again, we are learning and we are going to begin a new chapter today. Our chapter is about the Progressive Era, and this is the chapter that we should have covered in February 15th. So we are a solid like 2 weeks behind, but that's okay.
I thought we were doing better.
We were doing better, and then snowpocalypse happened, and then, benchmark, things like that. So what's probably going to happen is when we get to spring break, I may give you a list of videos to watch over spring break. And if you watch them, you should just get really caught up very quickly. Okay? Some reminders for everyone. Next Friday, you have to have your interview questions for your research paper. So refer to your instructions on that, okay?
Do we have to have them answered or
you have to come up with your research questions. So you don't have to have all of them answered. What you have to do is you have to come up with thoughtful questions that show to me that you've researched the topic and you're prepared for the interview. That way, over spring break, you should be able to go and do an interview. Okay, so this is chapter 23 or 22.
So what is your name and when were you born doesn't help?
No, those are just the beginning questions. We're talking about the meaty questions, questions where you actually talk about what you need to really talk about. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the Progressive Era. Okay, as we talk about the Progressive Era, this is a period of time in American history that lasts from approximately 1900 to 1920. Okay, but when we look at progressives and the progressive movement, it actually starts a little bit before. It's just 1900 to 1920 is when they're winning, okay? It's a political movement, but it gets its start before 1900, but in 1900, that's when they really, start to dominate and control, okay? Now, what is the Progressive Era? To understand the Progressive Era, we first need to refer back to the stuff going on before the Progressive Era in the Gilded Age, okay? What was the Gilded Age like? What do you remember, Mr. Brown?
It looked good,
On the outside,
but on the inside
it was not so good, right? Working conditions were bad, cities were crowded, politics was corrupt, segregation, discrimination, poverty, all sorts of problems across American society, okay? The government, how involved was it in anything?
Laissez-faire.
Laissez-faire, hands off. We're not involved at all, okay? And so the Progressive Era is in many ways a response to the Gilded Age. A simple way that I like to remember the Progressive Era is this is the period of time where people tried to solve the problems of the Gilded Age, okay? People just didn't sit around and just say, yes, so that's the idea of progress, moving forward, solving problems to move society forward, okay? When we talk about the Progressive Era, one of the best descriptions of the Progressive Era is a stained glass window, okay? Now, they were not stained glass windows, progressives, but rather think about a stained glass window from an artistic perspective. Each individual piece of a stained glass window is by itself a work of art, correct? So you have one tiny piece of colored stained glass, and it's beautiful on its own. And when you put lots of them together, you can create an even more beautiful work of art, okay? The Progressive Era is a series of reforms, and there's a lot of individual reform movements. And the Progressive Era itself is very diverse, okay? There's a lot of different types of progressives, different focuses, different people trying to solve different problems in different ways. And if you look at them all individually, they're each trying to do something to make America a nicer place to live. But since so many of them happened in such a short period of time, in such a related sequence, you have a big picture of a whole progressive era. Does that make sense? It wasn't like there was just everybody woke up one day on January 1st, 1900 and said, we're progressives now. That's not what happened. It was more gradual and organic. Over time, you have dozens and eventually hundreds of different reform movements that all happened during this time period. And later on, you have presidents who are progressives themselves that lead the movement nationally. And together, you see a transformation of American politics in the 1910s, 1920s, or 1900, 1910, leading 1920, okay? The roots of progressivism go back to the populist movement. We talked about the populist movement a few weeks ago. Those were the farmers who wanted the government to solve problems to make life for farmers better, okay? And one of the things that the populists wanted was the government to become more responsive to the people's needs. In general, the progressive era, you see government starting to get involved in society, solving problems. While the populists don't get what they want, the progressives achieve a lot of the populist goals, okay? For progressives, a centerpiece of their belief is that things can get better. Things can get better, they need to get better, they have to get better, and someone has to do something about it, okay? For progressives, they believe that government should take a part in society and make things better. But progressives are not just about government reform. A lot of progressive reforms are based off of voluntary efforts of individual people working and doing things to make life better. Some of the biggest progressives are simply people that are charity workers. Jane Addams, with 2 Ds, A-D-D-A-M-S. She is the founder of the Settlement House movement. We talked about her before, but her plan was not involving the government. Her plan to help poor immigrants have better lives, get education, help them find jobs, that was done through private charity. And a lot of the progressives, they focus on private charity, okay? But progressives are practical, okay? They are pragmatic. Their beliefs and their ideologies may differ. Some progressives may be different from others. And that's the thing. When you look at a typical progressive, they won't check all the boxes because they're all different. But what the progressives were was like a group of people, and they weren't like, they didn't have like matching shirts, okay? I'm not trying to say like progressives, they're just all like we're on a team. Eventually there is a progressive political party, but really it's kind of just like an attitude, okay? People who think that there are problems in American society that need to be fixed and we need to do something about it, okay? And most progressives have like their own little pet issue. Maybe it's temperance, getting rid of alcohol in American society. Maybe it's improving working conditions in factories. Maybe it's eugenics. There are some progressives who believe that the way to solve Americans' problems was to manipulate, the genes of America through, we'll talk about eugenics later, hopefully. But, there are people that, just because someone's a progressive doesn't mean that they're a nice person, okay? There's some racism in progressive era. But not all progressives are racist, okay? They're diverse. But what the progressives want is they want to solve problems and to move forward. And so some of them focus on certain issues more closely than others. There's progressives that focus on school reform. One of the more important progressives for education is this guy named John Dewey. I'll just give you an example of him. John Dewey was he's an educator, he's an educational philosopher, and he reformed a lot of schools, and he really pioneered the idea of like hands-on learning in American school system, learning by doing. And I think it's kind of funny because his name is Dewey. It's all about learning by doing. Anyways, but he's a progressive and he like reforms a lot of society. And like a lot of what they do is write books. A lot of the progressives, it's not like they go out and they change laws. They write books, they write essays, they write pamphlets, they spread it out, they spread the word, information spreads out, and then people voluntarily make changes. But sometimes the government does get involved, okay? When we look at a progressive, there are exceptions to the rule, But most progressives tend to be urban. They tend to live in cities, and they respond to the problems of life in the city. Most progressives tend to be of the middle class, okay? Really, really rich people, they don't care. They don't have any problems. Yeah, sure, there's problems in society, but it doesn't affect me. And then really poor people or the working class, they don't have time to go to book clubs or to go march on the street and protest or to join a consumer improvement society or whatever, okay? The working poor that are working like 60-hour day weeks in the factories, they're just scraping by. But as we talked about in the Gilded Age, there's a growing number of people that are in that middle class. Those lawyers, those doctors, those store owners, those middle managers, those professionals, the accountants, okay, that are in that middle class of society where they're not super uber rich. They still have problems, and the problems in society directly affect them, so they want to fix it. But they also have a little bit of disposable income and a little bit of free time to devote to social progress. A lot of progressives are women, and they're women of the middle class families, and that's not a coincidence. Okay, in a middle class family, you see it more commonly that the wife doesn't have to work like in a lower class family would, where you're working in the factory, the mom works and dad works and the kids work. Okay, in a middle class family, there's more leisure time, and there's more opportunity for women who are not working to read and to join book clubs and to spend some of their free time campaigning for women's rights. Okay, in fact, that's a big part of the woman suffrage movement, is middle class women who have a little bit extra time on their hands to write letters and to go march around and campaign for women to have the right to vote. So they tend to be urban, they tend to be middle class, they tend to be educated. Okay, not all progressives. Now listen, not all progressives live in the city, and not all progressives are middle class. There's rich and there's poor progressives. But not all progressives are highly educated, but that tends to be a commonality, is that they tend to have, some form of education that lets them, because they're always like reading and writing and arguing and stuff like that. Okay. And the final key thing you need to think about is they tend to be Protestant. A lot of them tend to be Protestant. Okay. And the Protestant version of Christianity tends to look at, the commands in the Bible to love your neighbor as yourself, and to, take care of those that are less fortunate. Those sort of ideas from Christianity influence a lot of the progressives, okay? Particularly the temperance movement. The temperance movement, pushing against the abuse and use of alcohol in America, a lot of their arguments are religiously based. And a lot of the motivation for charity work comes out of faith, okay? But not all progressives are Protestant. You'll find Catholic progressives or Jewish progressives or non-religious progressives, etc. But this is like in general, okay? So all of you can go home and find examples of a country, uneducated, poor, Jewish progressive, and it'll break all the rules. But like in general, it's the stereotype, yeah. So it's like, this is like the common sort of thread that you see, is that they tend to be urban, they tend to be middle class, they tend to be educated, they tend to be Protestant, okay? So how does the progressive process work? I don't have time to teach you about every single progressive reform, but typically the way a progressive reform works is through a process, and you can kind of map it out in your head, okay? The first step of a progressive reform. So think about that stained glass window. We're going to make one piece of that stained glass window. By itself, it's a good reform that changes American society for the better. But when you put lots of them together, collectively, it improves the whole country dramatically. Okay? So, step one, there's a problem. A problem in American society exists, and there's nothing being done about that problem. How can anyone solve anything unless you first identify the problem? The first step to solving a problem is identifying the problem. doctor cannot treat you unless you are diagnosed. And there enters the muckraker. Okay? A muckraker tends to be a journalist or a writer who investigates an issue in society and exposes it to the broader public. Okay? So, there's a problem, and a muckraker writes about that problem. They publish it in the newspaper. They write a book. It's a bestseller. People hear about this problem. And step 3, people get mad. The broader public. Remember, America is a democracy. If you want something to change, you need to get a good number of people to support that change. So people get mad when they hear about the problem and they want change. And when they demand change, eventually, step 4, the government passes a law or does some action to fix the problem. That is typically what happens in a progressive reform. Oh, and step 5, or we'll kind of just put this extra bonus point. Every time this happens, the government gets bigger. The government gets bigger and more powerful. And in some ways, people trade some of their freedom for security. We've talked about this before, that freedom and security tend to be exchanged one for another. In a totally free society, you have no security. In a totally safe society, you have no freedom. Okay? In the Gilded Age, Americans had a lot of freedom, but very little security. And so during the Progressive Era, people start making some changes that increase public security, but you could make the argument that you lose some freedom. Okay? So let's explain this using the jungle. American food had no regulation. Okay? Remember, the government's hands off. Okay? So when you go to the butcher and you buy hamburger meat, there is no guarantee from the government that that hamburger is indeed hamburger. Okay? All right? It could be anything. Now, if some business was selling hamburgers that were like killing people, then the government might get involved. Or if they were selling hamburgers that were just really gross, people would try it and they'd say, oh, this is gross, we're not going to buy this anymore, and they'd go buy somewhere else. Okay? So usually like the worst things people can handle. But here's the thing. You can hide a lot of stuff in sausage. Okay? There was this man named Upton Sinclair. He was a journalist. He was a muckraker. Upton Sinclair went and worked in a meat packing plant in Chicago for several months. While he was working, he was researching to write a novel called The Jungle. The Jungle was intended to talk about why workers in the meat packing plants in Chicago needed better working conditions, because the workers in those meat packing plants were terribly treated. Okay, they worked long hours, difficult job for very low pay, very high stress, and very dangerous. Okay, but he wrote this book, and it was supposed to get people upset about the problem of bad working conditions. But what people got really upset about was the quality of the meat that was produced in the meat packing plants. Okay? So I'll show you an excerpt. Okay. Here we go. You ready? All right. So this is from The Jungle. This is what Upton Sinclair wrote, and this is what would get people, this is what got people's attention. Okay, are you ready for a dramatic reading? The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, And so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. There were the butt ends of smoked meat and the scraps of corned beef and all the odds and ends of the waste of the plants that would be dumped into old barrels in the cellars and left there. Under the system of rigid economy which the packers enforced, there were some jobs that it only paid to do once in a long time. And among these was the cleaning out of the waste barrels. Every spring they did it. And in the barrels would be dirt and rust and old nails and stale water. And cartload after cartload of it would be taken and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and sent out to the public's breakfast. This was a thing, okay? Okay, if you're in this big gigantic meat factory and you're making thousands of pounds of sausage and there's a rat in there, who cares? It's going to be ground up and grind. Okay. We messed up. There's a little poop in here. I'll just throw it in there. Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay. All right. People read this. Okay, so that was step one, right? There's a problem. Step two, Muckrakers write about it. Okay, so he wrote about it. People got mad. People all across the country read the journal and they were furious. Okay, they were outraged about the fact. They were outraged about the just the fact that their food was not safe. Okay, you know who else read this book? A president named Theodore Roosevelt. Remember we talked about him on San Juan Hill. Okay, we'll talk about him some more in a second. But Theodore Roosevelt read this book. Congress read about it. They were mad, and so the government passed laws called the Meat Inspection Act. The Meat Inspection Act created a new government agency to inspect meat. The federal government would send out health inspectors to meat packing plants to make sure that the meat was safe to eat and that it was true. Because there was no law that stopped people from just slapping a label on a piece of sausage and saying, oh, this is 100% beef, when it was 100% not, okay? There's nothing stopping them. But the Meat Inspection Act went in to create safety and health safety in our food. In addition, because of Upton Sinclair and other muckrakers, Teddy Roosevelt pushed through another set of laws called the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act created something called the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is a portion of our government that regulates the production of food and drugs, medicine, to make sure that they are safe, that they have accurate labels. Okay? You can't sell medicine in the United States without the approval of the FDA. Okay? You have to, like a new drug, a new cure or whatever, it has to be approved by the FDA. They have to prove that it's safe. But in addition, the FDA also inspects food and makes sure that food has accurate labels. All food sold in America, pretty much in any store where you buy food, should have a label on it. Okay? That label is going to tell you the ingredients. It's going to tell you the nutritional facts. And it should be accurate. If it's not accurate, they can get in trouble with the law. Drugs also have the same sort of labels. They tell you what the ingredients are in the drug. They tell you what the drug's supposed to do, and they have to tell you what the side effects were. Before this, you could go into your bathroom, you could dump some soap in a glass bottle, and scratch a little bit of your dandruff in there and shake it up and slap and say, this is my miracle cure for baldness. Okay? Everybody take this drug and it'll fix your whatever, okay? There's all sorts of snake oil salesmen who would, create these medicines that would have fantastical claims. This will, cure cancer. This will make your hair grow back. This will do this. This will do that. And they're just like oil and some like cinnamon in it or whatever, and there's nothing stopping them or getting them in trouble. Okay. There were no regulations on medicine until the Progressive Era. Now, in this way, people's freedom is slightly reduced. Okay, you no longer have the freedom to just, do whatever you want with the medicine and sell it to people. But in some ways, that makes it nicer for other people who no longer have the freedom from dealing with people lying. Okay, but what it also does is it creates a growth in the government, right? Because now you have to have health inspectors, and those health inspectors got to get paid. who's going to pay them? Who's going to pay them? The government. Where's the government going to get the money? Taxes. Okay? So, all these things have a price. Most of the time, people in America are like, you know what? It's worth it. Like, I am willing to pay taxes to make sure that my meat is meat. Okay? Like, I am totally willing. Sign me up. Okay? But it's when a lot of these happen all the time, you get to a point where you have higher and higher tax rates and more intervention from the government. There's other progressive reformers. Ida Tarbell, she is a muckraker that targets the oil industry, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. She exposes a lot of the corruption of his business, which then leads to more government regulation of the oil industry. Jacob Rice, he writes a book called How the Other Half Lives, and it's all about bad living conditions in cities, how cities were crowded, how apartment buildings were like filled to bursting with people, and they were poorly sanitized, and life was difficult. How the Other Half Lives helped influence the growth of regulations for housing. Okay, today in America, apartment buildings have strict regulations on how they can be built, how big they can be, how many people can live in one dwelling. Okay, they have to have proper plumbing, proper electricity, proper safety standards. Okay. This is the era where you start seeing people building fire alarms, fire escapes, okay? Inspecting places to make sure that building codes are proper, okay? You can't just go and build a house and do it just however you want to, okay? You can't put, 50 different plugs on one, okay, so let me explain this one. With electricity and with plumbing, there are regulations from the government on how to rig your house safely, okay? All right? You can't have a toilet, say, without a vent, okay? Because toilets have to have a vent that allows, like, the gas to escape. Otherwise, it can create dangerous fumes, and it can be a problem for your plumbing, it can be a problem for you, it can be a bad time, okay? Now, it's just good sense to vent your toilet, but there are actually rules about it to make sure that people don't try to cut costs. Because if you're trying to build an apartment building real cheap, you might say, you know what, we don't need all these safety coatings on these wires. That's too much expense, okay? We're just gonna run it naked, okay? Save a little bit of money, and then start a fire 5 years later, whatever, it could be a problem. So what happens is you start to see more and more codes and more regulations to keep people safe, okay? The government is acting more and the regulatory state is growing. Now, a lot of progressive reform is without the government. There's a lot of growth in social work and charity, people doing things out of the goodness of their own heart. But as the progressive era continues, especially when you get presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in charge, the progressive era becomes really, really about government action, okay? So, the progressive era also contains the biggest push for women's suffrage, okay? Women's suffrage talks about the right for women to vote, okay? The women's suffrage movement gets kicked off in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, where a group of women and men declared that women should have the right to vote, should be treated equally to men in society, okay? The women's suffrage movement actually was born as a result of the abolitionist movement. 1848 is before the Civil War, and there was a lot of people in America in the abolition movement trying to abolish slavery that were women. And many of them wanted the right to vote so they could vote for politicians who would get rid of slavery. Specifically, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 happened after a world abolitionist meeting in London. Okay, so a bunch of abolitionists from all across the world met in London, and Americans went there, and the prominent women in the abolitionist movement were barred from being in the same room as the men at the abolitionist movement. They had to sit behind a curtain while the men talked about getting rid of slavery. And so a lot of the women that were abolitionists at that meeting decided to have their own meeting in Seneca Falls where they said that women needed to be treated equally to men and they needed the right to vote, okay? But the women's suffrage movement was also diverse. Not all people who wanted women to have the right to vote were on the same page about every single issue. And the progressive era sees a jump in the number of people fighting for women to have the right to vote to progress society forward. But they were dealing with a conflict that stretched back to the Civil War. You see, are you ready for this? Let me tell you something. Okay, the secret. Women can be racist. And just because someone does one thing good, it doesn't mean they can't do everything good. See, we live in a society today where we like to cancel people because they do one thing wrong, okay? And I would argue that that is a problem because you take an entire person and sum them up by their worst mistake. There's a lot of people in history that have done a lot of good, but also do bad. At the same time, there's a lot of people that do a lot of bad and do some good. And really what you need to realize is everybody's bad and you're bad too. So give each other a break, okay? But in the Civil War, many of the women who supported women's suffrage were not supportive of women's suffrage for all women, but just for white women, okay? And when the Civil War ended, there was a debate over something called the 15th Amendment. We talked about this at the beginning of the semester. The 15th Amendment was the amendment that gave people the right to vote regardless of their race, okay? This is the amendment that allows African American men to vote. But the 15th Amendment only applies to men and not to women. And so, when it came time for the 15th Amendment to be voted on by the different state legislatures, the women's suffrage movement had to decide if they would support or oppose the 15th Amendment. Now, a large number of the women in the women's suffrage movement were abolitionists, and they wanted African Americans to have freedom, and they supported the 15th Amendment because they said, you know what? African Americans need to be able to vote to defend their political interests. And so even if it means that African American men get to vote first before white women, we're okay with that. And so there's a group of women suffragists that support the 15th Amendment. But there's another group that says, no, how dare they? How dare they let African American men vote before white women? How dare they not give women the right to vote now? It's either everybody gets the right to vote or none, okay? And so the women's suffrage movement splits and it gets bad. They actually form competing women's suffrage associations, the ASA and the NUSA, or the AWSA and the NWSA. The American Women's Suffrage Association is the one that supported African American men getting the right to vote before women. Okay? This one, American. The American Women's Suffrage Association is led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. They were married. They're a married couple. Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. And they want women to get the right to vote, but they are more conservative in their approach, okay? They focus on the idea that women will get the right to vote gradually, okay? You see, for most of American history, most of the world, women did not have the ability to vote. In most of the democracies of the world, women never got to vote, okay? So this was a big change. And the American Women's Suffrage Association strategy is similar to how you boil a frog, okay? There's an old wives' tale about how to boil a frog. Do you know how to boil a frog, Nathan?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
You put the frog in the water and then you boil it.
There you go. If you get a hot pot of boiling water and you throw a frog in it, it's going to jump right out. But if you put a frog in cold water and slowly turn up the heat, it'll just sit there and boil. Now, I don't even know if that's actually true. I think people have experimented that. But anyways, but it's a fun story, okay? But don't do that experiment, by the way, okay? But anyways, kill the frog first before you eat it. Don't be cruel, okay? I'm not opposed to killing frogs and eating them. I'm just saying, kill them first, then boil them. That's an awful way to die. Anyways, that's what they do with crawfish, though. They just throw them in there and start boiling them. I mean, what are you gonna do? Like kill each individual crawfish before you throw it in the pot? This is how it is there. Anyways, moving on. So instead of going for women having the right to vote everywhere all the time, that's too much change. Okay, that's gonna be too much too fast. The AWSA is about tiptoeing into the water. Okay, like when you get into a really cold pool in the summer and you can either do it two ways. You can either put your toe in, put your foot in, and slowly ease in, or you can do a cannonball. Okay, these people tip their toes in. These are the cannonball people. Okay, all right. So the AWSA, they wanted to pressure state governments and gradually get women the right to vote. Okay, so what they do is they focus on schools first. Okay. Women should be able to vote for school board elections. Women, they're supposed to be the mothers and educators of their children. They should have the right to express their voice in the issues of the school, right? And so that's something, maybe you have a man who's just doesn't want women to vote. Maybe you can convince them, okay, women can't vote for the president, but I mean, they should be able to at least pick who's in charge of the school, because I mean, they're taking care of the kids. That's how you get them, okay? And so the man's all right, fine, you can vote in school elections. So women vote in school elections, and you know what happens? The schools fall apart and everyone dies. No, that's not what happens. It's just normal. Because, are you ready for your next science fact of the day? Women are people, and they can vote, and they can make rational decisions, and it's gonna be okay. And so, whenever the schools have normal elections and nothing goes crazy, that proves, hey, well, maybe women can vote in the city elections. And then when they vote in the city elections, then maybe they can vote in the state elections. And then maybe they vote in presidential elections. That's how it works. Gradually, bit by bit, moving things forward. Okay? So they would lobby states. These are the people that would bake pies and write letters and go to senators and be like, dear sir, we, the concerned women of America, would like to be able to vote in the presidential election. Here are reasons why. We baked you a pie. They're doing it the nice way. Okay? And they have some success. Wyoming is the first state that grants women full suffrage in 1869. And then Utah gives women the right to vote in 1870, okay? 50 years before the 19th Amendment is ratified. So women in Utah and Wyoming had been voting for about 50 years by the time the 19th Amendment came out. But the AWSA has their greatest success in the West, and they really struggle after that until 1890. In contrast to the AWSA, we have the NWSA, the National Women's Suffrage Association. Their leaders are a bit more famous, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. You've probably heard Susan B. Anthony's name. They wanted to get all women the right to vote now, not tomorrow, not in 5 years, not gradually. Every woman, every vote, all the way right now, today, with a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment would change all of the states all at once, and women could vote everywhere all the time. They are much more radical, okay? Now, they want women to have suffrage, but they oppose the 15th Amendment. Now, some of them opposed the 15th Amendment out of racism, and then some of them opposed it because they thought women should have the right to vote. If African-American men are going to get the right to vote, women should be able to vote too, okay? Some of them did. There's diversity even in here, but it's either all or nothing. They don't want a compromise. They don't want half of them getting to vote. They don't want be able to vote in half the elections. They want everywhere all the time. So they're there now, and there are some in this wing that don't want black people to vote. Okay, but that's not everyone. So don't think that. Again, most of the time in history, when I say they do this, you'll find like one or two exceptions. Okay, if I say everybody did this, immediately someone's going to be like, well, my grandpa, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yes, there's obviously an exception, but in general, that's what's going on. But they're more radical. They opposed the 15th Amendment. They were not happy with it. And they were more willing to do high-profile protests, things that kind of went out of the traditional roles of women, okay? The AWSA tried to use the traditional roles of women as like the mother and the caretaker and to like influence men to give them the right to vote. Whereas the NWSA, they're more radical. They're like, let's go out and let's protest. Let's go out on the street and march around with signs, which is something that wasn't common for women to do. Okay, all right? People used to think that elections were too rough and rowdy. It was a common practice in elections for people like to get drunk and to carouse and party on election day. And that was one of the excuses. Oh, women, they don't want to go vote. It's too vulgar. You know, women are too pure. They can't go there. So what they would do is they would hold mock elections, okay, where they would like set up an election booth right next to the actual one, and women would go and like fill out voting forms and they say, look, we can write our names on paper too. We can vote too. You see, we can put paper in a box, okay? They even had a woman run for president because technically, even though women couldn't vote for president, it wasn't unconstitutional for a woman to run for president. So Victoria Woodhull ran for president. She did not win, but she did like protest run. And these are the women that would actually go and try to vote and would get like arrested. Okay, so Susan B. Anthony is famous for getting arrested because multiple times she tried to vote breaking the law. Okay, and so she got arrested. Actually, President Trump pardoned her because she had a criminal record for breaking the law. And President Trump, one thing that he did as president was he pardoned Susan B. Anthony. And since Susan B. Anthony is no longer a criminal. So, fun fact. All right, so tomorrow, let's finish talking about the women's suffrage movement, okay? Hope you all have a good day, do good things, be good people, make good choices.
Are we gonna get our test back tomorrow?
Yes, I have graded them. So